It began with a phone call that ended far too quickly. Palace aides initially dismissed it as an ordinary disagreement, but whispers soon spread through royal corridors that King Charles had abruptly ended a conversation with Queen Camilla herself. Within days, an even more shocking rumor surfaced. Tom Parker Bowles had reportedly been told he was no longer welcome at Sandringham. What sounded impossible soon became the center of a growing royal storm. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the palace tried to treat it as nothing more than a private family, misunderstanding the kind of quiet tension every powerful household endures behind locked doors. But this was not just any household. This was the House of Windsor, where every invitation, every silence, every crossed name on a guest list can carry the weight of history. Reports suggest that the conversation between King Charles and Queen Camilla began with restraint, perhaps even with the careful politeness expected inside royal marriage. Yet somewhere in that exchange something shifted. Insiders whisper that Charles, already under immense pressure, finally reached the point where duty outweighed comfort, and the call ended before Camilla could soften the blow. What followed was colder than any official statement. Staff reportedly noticed the sudden change in tone. Aides, who normally exchanged quiet reassurances, became cautious. Courtiers who knew Sandringham's rhythms understood immediately that this was not ordinary tension. Sandringham is not simply a private retreat. It is memory, tradition, Christmas, inheritance, and monarchy wrapped into one sacred royal stronghold. So when whispers began circulating that Tom Parker Bowles had allegedly been barred from the estate, the meaning was impossible to ignore. This was not just about one man, it was about boundaries. For Camilla, the alleged decision would have cut deeply. Her son was not merely being kept away from a house. He was reportedly being pushed back from the symbolic heart of the royal family's private world. And for Charles, the decision carried its own torment. He had spent years balancing affection, loyalty, reputation, and royal duty, but now that balance appeared to be cracking in public view. The silence from senior aides only made the speculation louder. No denial came strong enough to kill the story. No reassurance arrived quickly enough to calm the storm. Royal watchers began asking the question the palace feared most. Had this conflict been building for months, hidden beneath smiles, ceremonies, and carefully managed appearances? Because the more the whispers spread, the clearer one thing became. This was not just a sudden emotional reaction. It looked like the first visible fracture in a much larger battle over influence, access, and the future shape of Charles's reign. But if a single phone call sparked concern, what happened next suggested the dispute was tied to something far bigger than a family disagreement. Sandringham has always been more than a country estate. For generations, it has served as one of the monarchy's most treasured private sanctuaries. That is why reports that a member of Camilla's family had become the focus of internal concern sent shockwaves through royal circles. To understand why the alleged ban carried such force, one has to understand what Sandringham represents inside the royal world. It is not merely a place where doors open and close according to family mood. It is one of the few spaces where monarchy becomes deeply personal, where private bloodlines, public duty, and historic memory collide. For decades, it has been tied to royal Christmases, family gatherings, grief, continuity, and quiet decisions that never needed a microphone to change the direction of the crown. So, when whispers began suggesting that Tom Parker Bowles had somehow become connected to concerns about access, protocol, and boundaries, the story took on a darker meaning. Reports suggest the unease was not about one dinner, one room, or one invitation. It was about what repeated access can symbolize. Inside royal circles, being welcomed into a place like Sandringham is never a small matter. It suggests trust. It suggests acceptance. It suggests a level of closeness to the institution that cannot easily be separated from influence. And that is where the tension reportedly sharpened. Because Camilla's family, though close to her personally, does not carry royal duty in the same way the working members of the firm do. They are private relatives, not guardians of the crown. That distinction may sound cold, but inside monarchy, distinctions are everything. Insiders whisper that senior figures began questioning whether the boundaries around royal spaces had become too blurred. Who had the right to be present? Who should be included in private traditions? And who, by simply being allowed through certain doors, might appear to inherit a kind of informal importance that was never granted by the crown itself? These were not casual questions. They went straight to the heart of legacy. Because Sandringham is not only a house filled with memory, it is a symbol of who belongs near the center of royal life when the cameras are gone and the real conversations begin. That is why the reported concerns surrounding Tom Parker Bowles became so explosive. It seemed to expose the quiet fear that personal loyalty could begin to reshape royal privilege. And for Charles, already carrying the burden of reign, illness, family fracture, and public judgment, Sandringham may have become the place where private affection finally collided with institutional duty. The estate that once represented comfort was suddenly being discussed as a battlefield of access, inheritance, and influence. As questions mounted around Sandringham itself, attention soon turned toward the people quietly shaping decisions behind palace walls. For years, King Charles was often described as the royal peacemaker, someone willing to avoid open confrontation whenever possible. Yet insiders now suggest that patience inside the palace had been stretched to its limits, setting the stage for a confrontation few expected to witness. The pressure around Charles had been building quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the polished surface of royal life. Every reign carries burdens, but his had become especially heavy. Public expectation, family fracture, health concerns, and the constant question of what kind of monarchy he would leave behind. Reports suggest that Charles had tried, again and again, to hold the line between private loyalty and public duty. He had given space, offered patience, and avoided open humiliation where he could. But restraint has a limit, even for a king. And according to palace whispers, that limit was reached when concerns over family influence began touching the sacred boundaries of royal property and royal trust. The alleged disagreements were not simply about Camilla's affection for her son or Charles's desire to keep peace within his marriage. They were about something far more dangerous inside a monarchy: perception. Who appears close to power? Who is granted access to spaces built on centuries of duty? Who benefits from the warmth of royal acceptance without carrying the weight of royal service? These questions reportedly became impossible to ignore. Sources claim Charles wanted clearer boundaries, not as an act of cruelty, but as a defensive wall around the crown. Because once the public begins to believe that private relatives can drift too easily into royal privilege, the monarchy itself starts to look less like an institution and more like a family arrangement. That is why the phone call became so symbolic. It was not the length of the conversation that mattered. It was the way it reportedly ended. Palace insiders described the moment as a sudden break in the usual pattern, a sign that Charles was no longer willing to soften every dispute with careful words and endless compromise. For Camilla, it may have felt like rejection. For Charles, it may have felt like survival. The tragedy was that both could be true at once. Behind the silence, private discussions reportedly grew more intense. Aides understood that any decision involving Sandringham would carry emotional force. Courtiers knew that restricting access connected to Camilla's family could not be treated as a routine administrative adjustment. It would be read as a message, a warning, a line drawn in royal stone. And once Charles crossed that line, there would be no easy return to the comfortable ambiguity that had protected everyone before. Yet ending a conversation was only the beginning, because another decision was reportedly already being prepared behind the scenes. When whispers of a potential restriction involving Tom Parker Bowles first surfaced, many dismissed them as impossible. But as more insiders began sharing similar accounts, the rumor refused to disappear, and suddenly palace staff were paying very close attention. At first, the idea seemed too severe to be true. A ban from Sandringham was not a small correction. It was not the kind of thing handled casually, quietly, or without layers of private discussion. Reports suggest that what began as a concern over guest privileges soon became a much deeper examination of royal boundaries. Who could come and go? who could be included in private moments tied to the monarchy's identity, and who, by repeated presence, might appear to hold influence that was never formally given. These questions moved through the palace like a warning bell, soft at first, then impossible to ignore. Senior courtiers were reportedly pulled into confidential conversations, not because Tom Parker Bowles himself was a public royal problem, but because the symbolism around him had become too sensitive. Sandringham is not neutral ground. It carries the weight of Christmas traditions, private gatherings, and the unspoken order of royal life. Any decision involving access to that estate would immediately raise questions about loyalty, favoritism, and the thin line between family kindness and institutional weakness. Inside the palace, perception can be as powerful as fact. And once courtiers began worrying about perception, the matter no longer belonged only to Charles and Camilla. The alleged concern was simple but explosive. Royal spaces cannot become extensions of private family ambition. Even if no wrongdoing is proven, even if the situation began as ordinary family closeness, the monarchy survives on discipline. It survives because people believe there are rules, ranks, and limits. If those limits blur, the crown becomes vulnerable to criticism. Critics begin asking whether royal privilege is being quietly shared beyond those who serve the institution. Supporters begin wondering whether the king is protecting tradition or avoiding a painful conversation. And enemies of the monarchy see an opening. That is why the reported restriction carried such brutal meaning. It suggested that Charles, or those advising him, had decided the risk of doing nothing was greater than the pain of acting. The divide between personal relationships and royal responsibility had widened into something far more dangerous. Camilla's role as wife and queen placed her at the center of both worlds. But those worlds were now pulling in opposite directions. One demanded compassion. The other demanded control. By the time Sandringham became the focal point of the dispute, the alleged ban was no longer being discussed as a private family matter. It had become a test of authority, a test of whether Charles could still draw a line when that line cut close to home. What made the situation even more explosive was the possibility that this was never about one visit, but about the future balance of power itself. Few people understood the pressure surrounding the situation more than Queen Camilla. Caught between her role within the monarchy and her loyalty to her own family, she reportedly found herself facing one of the most uncomfortable moments of her royal life. For Camilla, the alleged dispute was not simply political. It was personal, deeply personal. On one side stood the institution she had spent years trying to secure her place within, an institution governed by silence, rank, tradition, and sacrifice. On the other side stood her own blood, the family she had known long before crowns, titles, ceremonies, and public judgment entered every private room. Reports suggest she tried to soften the tension quietly, hoping the matter could be handled without public embarrassment. But once Sandringham entered the conversation, privacy began slipping away. Camilla's position has always carried a unique burden. As queen consort, she sits close to the center of royal power, yet she also carries a past that critics have never fully forgotten. Every move is examined. Every friendship becomes a question. Every family connection risks being turned into a headline. That is why the rumored restriction involving Tom Parker Bowles placed her in such a painful corner. Defend her son too strongly, and she could be accused of pushing private interests into royal territory. Stay silent, and risk appearing powerless at the very moment her own family was allegedly being pushed back. Insiders whisper that she sought to ease the situation privately, perhaps believing that Charles could still be persuaded, or that courtiers could be convinced the matter had gone too far. But the palace machine, once awakened, does not easily return to sleep. Concerns over favoritism had reportedly become too loud. The fear was not only what had happened, but what it might look like from outside the gates. If the public believed Camilla's relatives were gaining informal access to royal privilege, then the crown would face another wave of scrutiny at a time when it desperately needed stability. And that was the cruel heart of the crisis. Camilla had spent years trying to become a symbol of steadiness beside Charles, but now the story threatened to turn her into the center of a new conflict over influence. The woman who once stood beside the king in triumph was now reportedly forced to confront a question no royal spouse wants to face. Where does family loyalty end and royal duty begin? As media interest grew, the silence around became louder than any statement. Every refusal to comment fed the speculation. Every carefully controlled appearance became part of the larger mystery. And as Camilla's difficult position captured public attention, the real power players behind the monarchy began to measure what this dispute could mean for the future. But while attention focused on Camilla, another group within the royal family was quietly watching events unfold with increasing interest. Behind every royal controversy lies a larger question: what does it mean for the future? As speculation intensified, many observers began looking toward Prince William and the generation expected to inherit responsibility for the institution. William's name entered the conversation not because he was publicly at the center of the dispute, but because every decision made around Sandringham inevitably touches the future crown. Reports suggest that within royal circles, the younger generation views boundaries with a sharper, less sentimental eye. Where Charles has often been seen as careful, emotional, and willing to absorb discomfort for the sake of peace, William is increasingly understood as someone who thinks in terms of structure, discipline, and long-term survival. That difference matters. Because this controversy was no longer just about Camilla, Tom, or one estate. It was becoming a rehearsal for the monarchy William would one day inherit. The public already expects him to protect the institution with firmness. After years of family fracture, damaging interviews, private grievances turned public, and endless questions about royal privilege, the appetite for ambiguity has weakened. People want clarity. They want to know who represents the crown, who simply belongs to a royal-adjacent family circle, and who has no right to blur that line. That is where William's influence reportedly became impossible to ignore. Even in silence, his future position cast a long shadow over every private discussion. Insiders whisper that conversations around royal boundaries have become more serious as the monarchy moves through a delicate period. Charles is king, but William is the future. Every precedent set now may become a problem later. If private relatives are allowed too much informal closeness today, then tomorrow's sovereign may be forced to untangle a web he never created. That is why long-term legacy planning reportedly became part of the debate. Sandringham was not being discussed only as a place of tradition. It was being treated as a test case for how the next reign might defend royal spaces from confusion, entitlement, and outside pressure. There is also a generational contrast at play. Charles came from a world where family loyalty often survived through private compromise. William has lived through a different kind of royal crisis, one shaped by media storms, public mistrust, and the brutal speed of modern judgment. He knows that one unclear boundary can become a headline, one guest list can become a scandal, and one private exception can be turned into evidence of institutional weakness. For him, protecting the crown may require decisions that feel cold in the moment, but prevent deeper damage later. So as the alleged Sandringham restriction continued to echo through royal circles, it began to feel less like an isolated punishment and more like a warning from the future. The monarchy was preparing for a new order, one in which access would no longer be treated as casual, and legacy would be guarded before it could be challenged. And as the future came into sharper focus, the past suddenly returned to haunt the entire debate. At its core, this controversy appeared to revolve around a question that has challenged monarchies for centuries. When personal loyalty collides with institutional duty, which one wins? The British monarchy has survived not because it avoided family conflict, but because, again and again, it forced personal pain to bow before public responsibility. Behind every polished ceremony and every carefully managed appearance, there has always been a harsher truth. The crown cannot afford to behave like an ordinary family. It can love, but it must also limit. It can forgive, but it must also protect. And when privilege begins to look too personal, the institution has to step back before the public starts questioning the entire arrangement. That is why the alleged Sandringham dispute struck such a powerful nerve. It echoed older royal dramas, moments when private relationships became impossible to separate from constitutional duty, public image, and family rank. Royal history is filled with painful choices where access, titles, homes, and invitations became symbols of something much larger. A closed door could mean exile. A missing invitation could mean disgrace. A silence from the palace could speak louder than any public announcement. In that world, Tom Parker Bowles' reported restriction was not simply a personal embarrassment. It became part of a familiar royal pattern, the moment when affection meets the hard wall of tradition. Modern royals face an even sharper version of that test. The public no longer accepts mystery without suspicion. Every guest list is analyzed. Every family connection is examined. Every private decision becomes a question of fairness, influence, and entitlement. That is why concerns about privilege and access can spread so quickly. People may admire the monarchy's history, but they also want proof that the institution is not being quietly reshaped for personal convenience. They want to believe that duty still means something, that royal spaces are not casually open to those who carry no public burden. For Charles, the situation reportedly forced an agonizing choice. To protect Camilla's feelings could risk deepening public concern. To protect the crown could wound the woman beside him. That is the emotional brutality of monarchy. It takes private love and places it under public judgment. It turns family loyalty into a political question, and it leaves even a king with no painless option. This is why the story resonated far beyond Sandringham. It touched the oldest fear around royal life, that personal networks might creep too close to inherited power. It also touched the oldest defense of monarchy, that when the moment comes, the institution must place duty above comfort. So the alleged phone call, the silence, the rumored restriction, and the growing tension all began to form one larger picture. By the time the dust began to settle, many realized the story was never simply about one family member or one estate. The most revealing part of the entire episode may not have been the phone call, the rumors, or even the alleged restriction itself. It may have been the silence that followed a silence, that left the public searching for answers, while the monarchy quietly protected its own interests. That silence was not empty. In royal life, silence often becomes its own language. A denial can close a story. A statement can soften a scandal. But when the palace says nothing, when senior aides refuse to move beyond careful restraint, the silence begins to feel deliberate. Reports suggest that this was exactly what made the Sandringham dispute so powerful. The monarchy did not rush to explain. It did not open the doors and offer the public a neat version of events. Instead, it allowed the mystery to hang in the air, as if the institution had decided that protecting the crown mattered more than satisfying curiosity. For Charles, that silence carried the weight of legacy. His reign has already been shaped by pressure, transition, illness, family division, and the constant need to prove that the monarchy can remain steady in unsettled times. The alleged conflict involving Camilla's family placed another burden on that fragile balance. If he moved too softly, critics could accuse him of allowing private loyalty to weaken royal standards. If he moved too harshly, he risked deep personal pain inside his own household. Either way, the decision would become part of the story of his reign. That is why ongoing questions about family influence refuse to fade. Who belongs near the center of royal life? Who should be kept at a respectful distance? And how does a modern monarchy protect its sacred spaces without appearing cruel? These questions made the controversy larger than Tom Parker Bowles, larger than Queen Camilla, and larger than one alleged restriction at Sandringham. They reached into the future of the crown itself, where every blurred boundary can become a weapon in the hands of critics. Yet the monarchy's instinct has always been continuity. It absorbs storms. It endures humiliation. It allows private wounds to remain unseen while the institution moves forward. And perhaps that is why royal observers could not look away. The story contained everything that makes the House of Windsor so compelling: loyalty, fear, inheritance, silence, sacrifice, and the brutal cost of belonging too close to power. The phone call may have ended quickly, But the questions it raised lingered far longer, because, in the end, royal history is rarely defined by what is said openly. It is often shaped by the conversations that end abruptly, the doors that quietly close, and the legacies that survive long after the controversy fades. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.